By now you've probably seen the Samsung Galaxy S8 review, and you know that this phone is incredibly solid, has a bunch of features, and is in a easy to handle package. Also, it takes a pretty damn good picture. Now, whether or not the S8 is the best phone on the market is something that we kind of stopped short of saying, and it's hard to give a designation as to what exactly is the very best phone out there. After all, it's about your needs and whether or not this phone is going to tackle everything that you require from it. Now, with that said, there is one thing that gave us pause about the Galaxy S8, and it's what we want to talk about in this video. It's Joshua Vergara. What's going on, everybody? And the one thing missing from the Samsung Galaxy S8 is a dual camera. Now in this video, I'm not going to really say that any other cameras with dual lenses are better than the Samsung Galaxy S8. On the contrary, the S8 is still one of the best cameras that's out there. It's just a matter of exploring this new trend that we have with dual cameras and why the S8 might be falling behind a little bit by not providing that level of choice. After all, smartphone photography has really boomed over the last couple of years, and we've come a very long way. We've gone from the Sony CyberShot cameras with like 1.2 megapixels in them, and now we have everything we have now. It's an exciting time for photogs. And the smartphone has become not necessarily just the camera you had on you, but has now become a viable secondary shooter for any experienced photographer. Now, it's not really supposed to be that way. Smartphone photography, for all intents and purposes, is supposed to suck, and historically it did. But why? Well, the laws of physics. A camera sensor has to flood in all of the possible light in a scene in order to accurately and effectively create an image. Users and reviewers used to begrudgingly compare smartphone sensors to the kinds that we find on DSLR or now mirrorless cameras, knowing that it was probably unfair to do so. So as a response to all of this, companies tried very hard to find other ways of getting very good photos out of the data they could collect. Taking in as much data as they could in that small little area on the back of their smartphones, they turned to software and the interpretation of that data to create what would be a nice looking photo. And I actually remember when I thought that the companies were getting better at this. Again, it was Samsung back at MWC 2015 with the Galaxy S6.
Okay, I'll go to the Note 4. It'll be nice to revisit Samsung's cameras to see what we're going to find out, what we're going to get in the next one, in the S6. I have to say, all of you are saying are right. This is one of the best cameras on this ecosystem, and it's incredible. I love this thing.
It just got, bumped by the GS6.
Just got better, yeah.
It's like, wow.
What I want is the S6's 1.9 at manual focus.
Oh yeah, for sure.
That's exactly what I can't wait for, because
there is manual focus on the camera UI.
Yeah, there is.
On the GS6.
Exactly. That's what I can't wait for.
So there you go.
And this camera, over the last just 18 hours, I'm already back in love with this phone. I've reconverted, actually.
But going back to the single lens hardware, a lot of companies were trying to find hardware ways of making their photos better. And one way, they were trying to make their pixels a lot bigger. Now this is something you might recognize from the HTC phones, where they called them the ultra pixels. Now the problem with that was you ended up getting photos that were a lot smaller than your other counterparts that had maybe 3 times or even 4 times as many megapixels in their camera sensors. A more recent trend has been to make the megapixel count somewhere around 12, with the pixels being as big as possible. Samsung then returned by making these pixels focus pixels, adding in focus diodes that allowed for the focus speed to be incredibly fast on the Galaxy S7. So that's a brief history of Samsung's attempts to improve the camera game, taking the one sensor that they have on the back of their smartphones and making it as good as possible, the end result being the S8. However, somewhere down the line, these companies started to think outside of the box, and that's where these dual cameras come in. You might remember an extra eye appearing on the top of the HTC One M8, seemingly made to capture depth data so that users could harness bokeh like never before. And if you remember how that went, it was a good idea with some pretty poor execution. But this idea would be taken further by companies like Huawei and Honor, but instead of a depth sensor, it was a monochrome sensor that helped in capturing detail. This would actually be Huawei's trend leading up to the more recent P10 and P10 Plus, phones that have gotten some pretty high praise for their photography. Sure enough, other companies in the Android space would soon be following suit, adding dual cameras in their own little flavor so that you can get more choice with smartphone photography. The LG V10 is an example that comes to mind that put a dual camera on the front so you can fit more people into your frame when taking a selfie. However, that same idea was moved to the rear when you got the LG G5. And that was when the fun really began. Hardly anyone would call the G5 the phone of the year, but once you got past the failed attempt at modularity, the phone certainly had one great thing going for it: the dual camera. What you had here was a regular camera and then a wide-angle lens that allowed you to get almost GoPro-like action camera shots, and those were incredibly fun to use, even when you turned it around and you took a selfie, fitting in literally everybody and everything that was around you. That continued with the LG V20, which I did use for a vlogging with a smartphone segment here on Android Authority back at IFA 2015. And manual controls for video also made it an even better shooter for choice in the Android space. And this craze for dual cameras went outside the world of Android. You can obviously think about the iPhone 7 Plus, which added optical zoom by adding in a telephoto lens aside from its normal wider angle counterparts. And more recently, I was just able to take a look at the brand new Xiaomi Mi 6, which took the same idea and put it onto an Android device with all of its own fixings. So it's pretty obvious what I'm trying to say here. I love dual cameras, and I think that the trend has really shown the kind of innovation that you could see in smartphones today. Now, that's not to say that any single lens cameras are any worse than dual cameras. It's just that with a dual camera, you can eke out even more detail from those photos like Huawei has, and you can also get more choice and more flexibility with cameras like the LG G6, which I will admit is one of the first phones I go for because of that choice. So the Samsung Galaxy S8 is still one of the most highly recommended phones that we've seen so far this year. But if you want to have a little bit more choice, again, knowing exactly what your needs are, then maybe you would want to go to one of these other cameras that has a dual sensor. That way you'll be able to get, in the case of the G6, a wide angle shot on top of having the regular shots all put into the same package. And that's something that this Galaxy S8, unfortunately, is just not able to provide yet. Maybe Samsung will put a dual camera in one of their phones in the future, but at that time, we can probably expect Samsung to do something pretty spectacular with it, because evolution just goes that way. We've had a couple of years of dual cameras and attempts at dual cameras, so maybe one of these companies like the next Pixel or the next Samsung Galaxy device are going to really show us something special when you use more than one camera. Keep it tuned to Android Authority for even more about the Samsung Galaxy S8, and don't forget to check out our review if you haven't already. Stay tuned, and remember to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already so you can see more about all of the great flagships that we're seeing right now in 2017. And then stay tuned for even more, because we are your source for all things Android.